August 20th, 1944. A field hospital between Argentan and Falaise, France. The acrid smell of sulfur hangs heavy in the morning air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the earthy dampness of freshly turned soil. Young Günter Gräwe lies on a makeshift stretcher, his wounded foot throbbing beneath hastily applied bandages. The 19-year-old Panzer crewman stares at the canvas ceiling of the medical tent, listening to the distant rumble of approaching engines. Engines that sound different from the familiar growl of German panzers. These engines carry a higher pitch, a mechanical certainty that speaks of American industrial might rolling across the Norman countryside. Through the tent flaps, Gräwe glimpses the dust clouds rising on the horizon. American Sherman tanks advance in formation, their steel hulls gleaming in the harsh August sunlight. The sound grows closer. Not just tanks, but trucks, jeeps, the organized thunder of an army that has crossed an ocean to be here. In this moment, suspended between his old world and an unknown future, Gräwe cannot imagine that within weeks he will stand before a prison camp commissary, holding 80 cents in his palm, wrestling with an impossible choice. Ice cream or Coca-Cola? Two luxuries he had only heard about in whispered conversations. Two symbols of a prosperity so foreign they might as well have been artifacts from another planet. The German High Command had prepared their soldiers for many possibilities in this war. They had trained them to fight in the frozen steppes of Russia, in the scorching deserts of North Africa, in the bocage country of Normandy. But they had never prepared them for abundance. They had never prepared them for the moment when enemy hands would offer not cruelty, but kindness. They had never prepared them for the psychological warfare of generosity, for the devastating realization that everything they had been told about their enemies might be a lie. As the American voices grow louder outside the tent, speaking in that peculiar nasal accent of the Midwest, Gräwe closes his eyes and thinks of his mother and sister back in Ludenscheid, rationing their meager portions of ersatz coffee and black bread. He thinks of the propaganda posters that promised victory, while German children... The tent flap opens. An American medic enters, his uniform clean, his face young and earnest. He kneels beside Gräwe's stretcher and says something in English. Words of reassurance, perhaps, or simply the practiced phrases of military medical protocol. The tone is gentle, professional. There is no hatred in his voice, no triumph, no desire for revenge. This surprises Gräwe almost more than the capture itself. Where is the brutality he has been promised? Where are the savage Americans who supposedly torture prisoners and feed them nothing but bread and water? The medic checks Gräwe's bandages with careful hands. His touch is clinical, but not harsh. When he reaches for his medical bag, Gräwe sees something that makes him blink in disbelief. A small chocolate bar tucked among the bandages and medicines. The American notices his gaze and, with a slight smile, hands him the chocolate. Real chocolate, dark and rich, wrapped in paper that crinkles with the sound of abundance. Gräwe stares at it as if it were made of gold, this simple candy bar that represents more calories than he has seen in a single portion for months. This moment, this first taste of American plenty, will haunt Gräwe for the rest of his life. Not as a trauma, but as a revelation. It is the moment when the carefully constructed worldview of the Third Reich begins to crumble, replaced by something more complex and infinitely more troubling. The recognition that their enemies possess not just superior firepower, but superior humanity. The journey from the Norman Field Hospital to Fort Lewis, Washington, unfolds like a fever dream of impossibilities. First comes the transport to Southampton, where German prisoners are loaded not into cattle cars, but into ambulances and medical vehicles. The wounded receive treatment from British doctors who work with the same diligence they would show to their own soldiers. Gräwe watches, bewildered, as his infected foot wound is cleaned and properly dressed by an enemy physician, who speaks to him in broken German, asking about his pain level and medical history, as if he were a patient rather than a prisoner. Then comes the Queen Mary, that floating palace of the seas, requisite. The meals come with utensils, with napkins, with the assumption that even enemy soldiers deserve to eat like human beings. Gräwe sits at a long table in the ship's converted dining hall, surrounded by fellow prisoners who whisper among themselves in tones of amazement and confusion. Across from him, a veteran sergeant from the Eastern Front stares at his plate of roast beef and potatoes as if it might disappear at any moment. The man has spent 3 years fighting in Russia, surviving on field rations and whatever could be foraged from the countryside. He has not seen this much meat on a single plate since before the war began. "They're fattening us up for something," the sergeant mutters, but his voice lacks conviction. "No army feeds its prisoners this well without a reason." But what reason could there be? The German soldiers have been taught that Americans are soft, decadent, unprepared for the hardships of war. They have been told that American soldiers are poorly trained civilians who crack under pressure, that American society is weak and divided, obsessed with material comforts, while lacking the iron discipline necessary for true military might. Yet here they are, prisoners aboard an American vessel, eating better than they did as free soldiers in the German army. The contradiction gnaws at them like a philosophical wound. As the Queen Mary cuts through the Atlantic swells, Gräwe begins to understand that this treatment is not an anomaly or a trick. It is policy. It is deliberate. It is the product of a society that has codified the humane treatment of prisoners not as weakness, but as strength, not as naivete, but as moral superiority. The Geneva Convention is not just a document to these Americans. It is a living principle, a statement of values that they uphold even when dealing with those who have sought to destroy them. The realization comes to him gradually, like sunrise over the ocean. These people, these Americans, they are not just winning the war through superior numbers and industrial capacity. They are winning it through superior ideas. They have created a society so prosperous, so confident in its principles, that it can afford to treat its enemies with dignity. They have built a civilization where abundance is so taken for granted that sharing the towers of steel and glass rise like monuments to human ambition, each building taller than anything in German cities, the whole metropolis glowing with electric light, even in the middle of the day. This is not the weak, decadent America of Nazi propaganda. This is a colossus, a nation so wealthy and powerful that it can wage war on 3 continents while its civilians live in luxury that German citizens could barely imagine. The train journey from New York to Seattle provides a rolling panorama of American abundance. Through the windows, the German prisoners see endless fields of corn and wheat, factory complexes that dwarf anything in the Ruhr Valley, cities that sprawl for miles without showing signs of war damage or economic hardship. They see automobiles on every street, electric lights in every window, well-fed children playing in schoolyards that seem to exist in a different universe from the bombed ruins of German cities. One prisoner, a young man from Hamburg whose neighborhood has been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, presses his face to the train window and weeps. Not from homesickness or despair, but from the sheer overwhelming realization of what they have been fighting against. How do you defeat a nation that can build cities like Chicago while simultaneously producing enough weapons to supply armies on 3 continents? How do you overcome an enemy whose industrial capacity is so vast that they can afford to feed their prisoners better than their own soldiers eat. Fort Lewis, Washington, appears before them like a small city unto itself. The camp stretches across thousands of acres with neat rows of wooden barracks, administrative buildings, recreational facilities, and a commissary that stocks goods many German civilians have not seen since before the war began. The prisoners are processed with methodical efficiency, photographed, interviewed, assigned housing and work details. But even the processing reveals the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to human organization. The American guards are professional, but not cruel. They follow procedures without sadism, maintain discipline without brutality. When they speak to the German prisoners, they use a tone that acknowledges their humanity. There are no beatings. Each man has his own bunk with clean sheets, his own footlocker for personal belongings, his own place at the communal table where they take their meals. The barracks are heated in winter, ventilated in summer, lit by electric bulbs that provide more illumination than most German homes. There are windows with glass that is not blacked out, through which the prisoners can see the Olympic mountains rising like frozen waves against the Washington sky. The daily routine establishes itself with clockwork precision. Reveille at 6 a.m., followed by breakfast in a mess hall that serves portions calculated to provide adequate nutrition for men engaged in physical labor. The breakfast itself becomes a daily source of amazement. Real eggs, real bacon, bread made from wheat flour rather than the sawdust extended ersatz bread of wartime Germany. Coffee that tastes like coffee rather than roasted grain. Butter, actual butter, served in quantities that German civilians would consider extravagant. After breakfast comes work detail. The prisoners are organized into crews that travel by truck to farms throughout eastern Washington, where they harvest apples, potatoes, sugar beets, and other crops. The work is hard, but not punitive. They are provided with proper tools, adequate rest breaks, and drinking water whenever they need it. At the end of each workday, they receive payment: 80 cents for regular prisoners, 10 cents for those identified as Nazi party members. 80 cents. Enough to buy luxuries at the camp commissary that represent pure abundance to men who have lived through 4 years of total war. It is in that commissary that Gräwe faces his moment of revelation. Standing before shelves stocked with cigarettes, chocolate bars, magazines, and small luxuries, he holds his day's wages and contemplates an impossible choice. Ice cream. Real ice cream, made with real cream and sugar, served in portions that would have fed a German family for a week. Or Coca-Cola, that mysterious American beverage he has heard about but never tasted, bottled in glass that catches the light like liquid amber. The commissary represents more than commerce. It represents philosophy. Here is a society so prosperous that it can afford to sell luxury goods to its prisoners. The ice cream is a revelation. Cold, sweet, rich with flavors that seem to contain all the abundance of American dairy farms. The Coca-Cola is equally astonishing, not just for its taste, but for what it represents. A drink so purely recreational, so divorced from basic nutrition, that only a society with absolute confidence in its food security would invent such a thing. As he sips the fizzy dark liquid, Gräwe realizes he is tasting the essence of American excess. Not the decadent weakness that Nazi propaganda described, but the casual abundance of a civilization that has solved the basic problem of survival so thoroughly that it can afford to create pleasure for its own sake. This moment, August or September 1944, standing in the Fort Lewis commissary with ice cream melting on his tongue and Coca-Cola fizzing in his mouth, becomes the pivot point of Gräwe's understanding of the war and his place in it. He realizes that he has been captured not just by a superior military force, but by a superior idea of what human society can be. He realizes that the Germany he has been fighting for, the ideology he has embraced, the future he has imagined, all of it is built on scarcity, on the assumption that human beings must struggle against each other for limited resources, that strength comes from deprivation and discipline from hunger. But here is a different model: strength through abundance, discipline through voluntary cooperation, victory through the simple expedient of providing people with more than they need and then asking them to choose how to use it. The American approach to prisoner management is not just humane, it is a form of ideological warfare, a demonstration that their system can afford luxuries that the German system cannot provide, even to its own soldiers. The months pass with a rhythm that slowly transforms the German prisoners from soldiers into something else. Not Americans, but men who have experienced American values. They work in the fields during harvest season, earning money that they spend on small luxuries that represent enormous psychological victories over the scarcity that has defined their adult lives. They attend educational programs where American instructors teach them about democratic government, market economics, and civil liberties, not as propaganda, but as practical information about how a free society functions. If American society is as weak and decadent as they have been taught, how has it managed to project military power across two oceans while maintaining prosperity at home? If American values are inferior to German ones, why do American prisoners eat better than German soldiers? If democracy is inefficient compared to dictatorship, how has democratic America outproduced authoritarian Germany by such overwhelming margins? The letters that begin to arrive from home provide painful context for these questions. Gräwe's mother writes about rationing, about air raids, about neighbors who have lost sons on the Eastern Front. She describes a Germany where children collect scrap metal for the war effort, while growing thin on ersatz coffee and turnip soup. She mentions, almost in passing, that real chocolate has disappeared from the stores entirely, that even party officials struggle to find adequate food for their families. Reading these letters while sitting in a heated barracks, having just finished a meal that included meat, vegetables, bread, and dessert, Gräwe confronts the fundamental contradiction of his situation. He is a prisoner of war, technically defeated, theoretically at the mercy of his enemies. Yet he is eating better, sleeping more comfortably, and living with greater security than his own family back in Germany. The very people who are supposed to be his captors are treating him with more consideration than his own government showed him when he was a free soldier in the German army. This realization comes with a devastating emotional cost. To acknowledge American superiority in material terms is one thing. Industrial capacity can be measured, military effectiveness can be calculated. But to acknowledge moral superiority requires admitting that everything he has fought for, every one he has seen die, every sacrifice he has made or witnessed, has been in service to the wrong cause. It requires accepting that his enemies are not just stronger, but better, not just more powerful, but more humane. The process of this acknowledgement unfolds slowly, day by day, meal by meal, through small acts of decency that accumulate like compound interest. American guards who learn prisoners' names and ask about their families. Work supervisors who provide cold water during hot harvest days without being asked. The Americans have created systems that assume enemy soldiers deserve humane treatment, not as a strategic calculation, but as a moral principle. They have built a society where abundance is so assumed that sharing it with prisoners seems natural rather than revolutionary. They have demonstrated that victory can be achieved not just through superior force, but through superior values lived out in daily practice. As winter settles over the Pacific Northwest, bringing rain that drumsticks against the barracks windows and temperatures that turn the Olympic mountains white with snow, Gräwe begins to understand that his time as a prisoner of war is also his education in what human society can become when it abandons scarcity thinking. Every meal, every heated building, every small luxury purchased at the commissary represents a choice made by American society. The choice to treat abundance as normal rather than extraordinary. The choice to extend dignity even to those who have sought to destroy them. The war ends in Europe on May 8, 1945. But the news reaches Fort Lewis not as triumph or tragedy, but as simple information. The German prisoners gather in the main hall to hear the announcement from camp administrators, who deliver it without gloating or celebration. Just the facts, presented with the same professional courtesy that has characterized their entire imprisonment. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war is over. The process of repatriation will begin as soon as practical arrangements can be made. For Gräwe and his fellow prisoners, this moment brings not relief but anxiety. They have grown accustomed to American abundance, to the rhythm of work and compensation, to the simple security of knowing that 3 meals will appear each day without fail. The prospect of returning to a Germany devastated by bombing, occupied by foreign armies, struggling with reconstruction and denazification, seems less like liberation than like exile from the only prosperity they have known in years. Some prisoners express these concerns openly, admitting that they have been better fed and housed as American captives than they ever were as German soldiers. Others maintain ideological loyalty to the Reich, even as they acknowledge the material superiority of American society. Still others, like Gräwe, find themselves caught between gratitude for their humane treatment. The repatriation process takes 2 more years, during which time Gräwe and other German prisoners continue their routine of work and education, earning money, and learning skills that will serve them in the post-war world. They study English, vocational trades, basic principles of democratic government and market economics. They attend religious services conducted by German chaplains but supervised by American military authorities who ensure that the message focuses on reconciliation rather than resentment. During this extended period, the psychological transformation that began with ice cream and Coca-Cola reaches its completion. The German prisoners are not just being held, they are being rebuilt, reconstructed as men who have experienced an alternative to authoritarian scarcity, who have learned that abundance and freedom can coexist, that strength can be demonstrated through generosity rather than cruelty. When Gräwe finally boards the ship that will take him back to Germany in 1947, he carries with him more than personal belongings and memories. He carries a different understanding of what human society can be, a different vision of the relationship between government and citizen, a different appreciation for the power of systems that assume human dignity rather than demanding its constant proof. The return to Germany confirms everything he has learned during his imprisonment. His homeland is a landscape of rubble and reconstruction, where food remains scarce and luxury non-existent, where the basic infrastructure of civilized life, roads, bridges, electrical systems, water treatment plants, has been bombed into dysfunction. The contrast with American abundance is so stark as to be almost surreal. In America, even prisoners ate meat every day. In Germany, even free citizens struggle to find adequate nutrition. But Gräwe brings more than memories back to this devastated country. He brings skills learned in American vocational programs, language abilities developed through interaction with American guards and supervisors, and most importantly, a vision of what prosperity looks like when it is built on freedom rather than conquest, on cooperation rather than domination. These lessons will serve him well as he builds a new life in the post-war world, founding an import-export company that puts to use the English, French, and Spanish he learned during his imprisonment. The chocolate bar remains the symbol that ties it all together. Throughout his imprisonment, through the journey across the Atlantic, through the seasons of work and education at Fort Lewis, through the long process of repatriation and reconstruction, that simple candy bar represents the fundamental difference between scarcity thinking and abundance thinking, between societies built on deprivation and societies built on plenty. In Nazi Germany, chocolate was a luxury reserved for the elite, rationed carefully, and distributed as a reward for political loyalty. Children grew up without tasting real chocolate. Adults remembered it as a pre-war memory. Soldiers in the field received ersatz substitutes made from sawdust and chicory. The scarcity of chocolate was not accidental. It was policy, part of a system that used deprivation as a tool of control, that demanded sacrifice as proof of patriotism, that justified suffering as necessary for future glory. In America, chocolate was available in the commissary of a prisoner of war camp, purchasable with money earned by enemy soldiers for agricultural labor. American children ate chocolate as a matter of course. American soldiers carried chocolate in their field rations. American civilians bought chocolate at corner stores without thinking about its political implications. The abundance of chocolate was not accidental either. It was the natural result of a system that had solved the basic problems of production and distribution so thoroughly that luxury had become commonplace. This difference between chocolate as political reward and chocolate as consumer choice encapsulates the ideological victory that America achieved over Germany. It was not just a victory of tanks and planes and industrial capacity, though those mattered. It was a victory of systems thinking, of institutional values, of fundamental assumptions about what human beings deserve and how societies should be organized. The German approach assumed scarcity and used it to justify hierarchy, control, and sacrifice. The American approach assumed abundance and used it to demonstrate freedom, dignity, and possibility. When these two systems came into conflict, the outcome was never really in doubt. A society that could afford to give ice cream to its prisoners would inevitably defeat a society that could not provide adequate food for its own children. 73 years later, when Gräwe returns to Fort Lewis,
The words might seem overwrought, but they represent something profound. The recognition that his capture was not his defeat, but his liberation. Not his punishment, but his education. Not his humiliation, but his introduction to a better way of organizing human society. Standing in the same commissary where he once chose between ice cream and Coca-Cola, Gräwe tells American military personnel that the day of his capture was the luckiest day of my life. The statement might sound like the sentiment of an old man looking back through rose-colored glasses, but it represents a hard-won understanding of what victory actually means. Victory is not just the defeat of enemies. It is the demonstration of superior values lived out in daily practice. Victory is not just conquest. It is conversion through example rather than force. The American treatment of German prisoners during World War II was many things: a practical necessity, a strategic calculation, a legal obligation under international law. But it was also something more rare and valuable. It was a demonstration that abundance and humanity can coexist, that prosperity can be built on freedom rather than oppression, that strength can be demonstrated through generosity rather than cruelty. In the end, the story of German prisoners discovering ice cream and Coca-Cola in American camps is not really about food. It is about the power of systems to shape human experience, the importance of institutional values, and the way that abundance, real abundance, not just material wealth but moral and spiritual plenty, can serve as the foundation for a different kind of strength. The prisoners who returned to Germany carrying memories of American generosity
became inadvertent ambassadors for democratic values, living testimonies to the possibility of societies organized around cooperation rather than competition, abundance rather than scarcity, freedom rather than control. They carried these lessons into the reconstruction of post-war Germany, into the creation of the social market economy that would make West Germany a model of democratic prosperity. The chocolate bar, the ice cream, the Coca-Cola. These were not just treats for homesick soldiers. They were symbols of a civilization that had solved the fundamental problems of human organization so thoroughly that it could afford to demonstrate. And in that achievement lay the real victory of World War II. Not just the defeat of fascism through military force, but the demonstration that democratic abundance could provide a more compelling vision of human possibility than authoritarian scarcity. The German prisoners, who tasted that abundance, who experienced that generosity, who lived under those values, became witnesses to the truth that freedom and prosperity are not contradictory, but complementary, not competing, but cooperating in the great human project of building societies worthy of human dignity. That truth, more than any weapon or strategy, ensured that the victory would be lasting, that the peace would hold, and that the chocolate would always taste sweeter when shared with former enemies, who had become, through the simple expedient of humane treatment, friends.